Steve Martin tells us about 9 actors who are really mean. Steve Martin is a very famous, funny person in Hollywood. He's super careful about how he makes jokes and acts in movies. He thinks about every word and every move he makes. Steve doesn't just tell jokes, he builds them like puzzles, said someone who worked with him many times. Every pause, every hand movement, every word he picks is done on purpose. He makes comedy like someone building a perfect clock. This careful way of working has made Martin one of America's best funny people for a really long time. He started as a wild and crazy guy and then became a really good actor, writer, and music player. But this same perfectionism has made him not get along with other actors who work very differently from his super careful way. Steve doesn't say bad things about other actors to newspapers, said a friend who's known him for years. That's not what he does. But don't worry, he sees everything and he remembers. If someone messes up his work or is mean to others, that person won't work with him again. His memory for bad behavior is like a camera. Tonight we talk about 9 entertainers who Steve Martin really doesn't like because of things that happened during his long career. These are actors whose ways of being funny and working are totally different from Martin's careful, nice way of doing things. Take your medicine here. Take your medicine, you fat. You didn't give us a script, we can't go on that we doing during the week. One Chevy Chase. The big ego that ate up the whole movie set. The problems between Steve Martin and Chevy Chase started when they made a movie called Three Amigos in 1986. What should have been a fun comedy movie quickly showed that the two men worked very differently and got along badly. It was like watching 2 different types of animals try to talk to each other, said someone who worked on the movie. Steve would come ready, having learned every line by heart, ready to work with others. Chevy would show up with his own ideas about how scenes should work, often totally different from what was written in the script. Many people said that Chase's bad behavior went beyond just having different ideas about the movie into things that really bothered Martin, who is always very polite. Chase apparently rewrote dialogue to give himself better lines, sometimes taking away good parts from the other actors, and treated the crew members in a dismissive way that really upset the famously nice Martin. Steve believes strongly that movies are team efforts where everyone deserves to be treated nicely, said a producer who worked with Martin on several movies. Chevy seemed to think the opposite, that everyone else was there just to make him look good. This big difference in thinking apparently came to a breaking point during one really hard day of filming, after Chase had apparently demanded lots of script changes that made his character more important than the group. Martin was heard saying to director John Landis, "If ego was money, Chevy could buy Wall Street." What bothered Martin most, people who knew the situation said, wasn't just that Chase was selfish, but how it affected everyone around him. "Steve once told me that really great funny people make everyone in a scene better," said a director who worked with Martin after Three Amigos. He felt Chevy did the opposite. He would deliberately ruin other actors' moments if it meant getting more attention for himself. While both men stayed polite during press appearances for the movie, people in the industry noticed that Martin never worked with Chase again, a pattern that would happen again with others who crossed certain professional lines. What makes Steve's reaction to Chevy especially notable is that Steve rarely says bad things about co-workers, said the producer. But with Chase he made an exception. "I once heard him describe Chevy as a comedy genius with no soul behind it. Coming from someone as careful with words as Steve, that's really harsh." This experience apparently confirmed something Martin had noticed throughout his career, that talent without being professional creates a really bad working environment. No matter how funny the performer might be, applause, you guys are just too. Jim Carrey, the human hurricane. The problems between Steve Martin and Jim Carrey show a big clash between 2 totally different ways of being funny. Martin's carefully planned humor is totally different from Carrey's wild improvisational energy, a difference that apparently came to a head during an award ceremony in the mid-1990s. People who were there said that Carrey was giving an acceptance speech that had gone way longer than it should have and was getting more and more crazy. Martin, who was supposed to present the next award, apparently decided to bring some order to the situation by coming on stage with a handmade "Wrap It Up" sign. A moment meant as gentle comedy that apparently created lasting tension. "Jim took it personally," said someone who saw the incident. What Steve meant as a light-hearted joke about awards show timing, Carrey seemed to think was a real criticism of his performance. The feeling in the room definitely changed. While both men stayed polite in their public interactions afterward, people who know Martin claim he found Carrey's frantic approach to comedy and performance really exhausting. Steve apparently described working with Carrey as like doing math problems in a blender, said a co-worker who worked with both comedians. It wasn't that he didn't respect Jim's talent. He totally did. But their approaches were so totally different that working together became nearly impossible. The main issue, people who knew Martin's perspective said, wasn't Carrey's manic energy itself, but rather how that energy affected everyone around him. Steve sees comedy as a conversation, a give and take that requires listening as much as performing, said a director who worked with Martin. In his view, Carrey's approach was more like a one-person show that used up all the attention in a scene, leaving nothing for anyone else. This basic difference in thinking apparently made Martin reluctant to work directly with Carrey, despite chances that came up over the years. Industry insiders said that Martin said no to several projects that would have put the two comedians together, believing their styles were simply incompatible. Steve apparently called Carrey an attention vampire in private conversations, said a producer who worked with both men. He felt Jim would take over every moment with zero care for rhythm or anyone else in a scene. It wasn't personal. It was a real belief that their approaches to comedy were totally incompatible. What makes this particular clash noteworthy is that it appears to come not from any personal dislike, but from a deep difference of opinion about what comedy should be. A difference that made meaningful working together between two of America's most gifted comedians effectively impossible. But we were really lucky, because we got to actually lay our two eyes on her. He the Queen. Have you ever seen her? Oh, kids. She is the whitest woman in the whole world. 3. Bette Midler, the spotlight stealer. The problems between Steve, Martin and Bette Midler apparently came from an incident at a charity gala they hosted. Together in the early 1990s, people who were there said that what should have been a team effort of entertainment became something quite different when Midler apparently took control of the event in a way that Martin found really problematic. Steve had prepared carefully for the event, working with writers to create a smooth show that balanced comedy with the serious purpose of the fundraiser, said an organizer who worked on the gala. Bette had other ideas. Without warning, she started an unplanned musical number that completely changed the tone and pacing of the evening. Many sources said that Martin was visibly shocked by this unexpected change from the agreed-upon plan. What bothered him most, they claim, wasn't the performance itself, but the one-sided decision-making that messed up the carefully planned event. Steve believes deeply in the importance of working together and mutual respect, said a co-worker who worked with Martin on similar events. What he apparently saw that night was someone putting their own desire to perform above the group goal of the evening, which was raising money for charity. The situation apparently came to a breaking point when Martin apparently left the event early, leaving behind a big donation with a note that, according to one witness, read, "Tell Bette it came from her biggest fan." Silence. While both performers stayed polite in later public appearances, industry insiders noted that Martin never worked with Midler again, continuing a pattern of quietly staying away from those whose approach to performance he found problematic. What Steve apparently found most troubling wasn't Bette's talent, which he respected enormously, said a producer who worked with both performers. It was what he described as performative narcissism disguised as generosity, using a charitable event mainly as a platform for self-promotion rather than focusing on the cause itself. This incident speaks to Martin's bigger philosophy about entertainment and professionalism. Specifically, his belief that true collaboration requires respecting agreed-upon rules and thinking about how one's actions affect the overall experience for everyone involved, including the audience. "Steve once told me that great performers make everyone around them better," said a director who worked with Martin. In his view, what Bette did that night was the opposite. She didn't collaborate. She consumed the event for her own purposes. While this tension never turned into public disagreement, People familiar with Martin's carefully maintained professional boundaries understood that the incident likely ended any possibility of future collaboration between two of entertainment's most distinctive talents. Is there? I don't know what the hell that is. What in the hell is that? 4. Bill Murray. The unpredictable element. The reported problems between Steve Martin and Bill Murray show the clash between structure and chaos that has defined many of Martin's professional relationships. Industry insiders said that the tension began during a live television appearance in the 1980s, when Murray apparently disrupted the carefully planned segment in ways Martin found deeply problematic. Steve had prepared really carefully for the appearance, as he always does, said a television producer who saw the incident. Bill showed up late, seemed completely uninterested in the rehearsed material, and then went ahead and undermined the planned structure once they were on air. Multiple sources said that Murray apparently made fun of Martin while they were performing and deliberately messed up the comedic timing of the prepared material, behavior that attacked the heart of Martin's precisely planned approach to comedy. Steve believes in respecting the material and the audience, said a writer who worked with Martin. In his view, what Murray did wasn't spontaneous brilliance. It was unprofessional sabotage of something people had worked hard to create. The incident apparently had long-lasting consequences. People close to both men said that Martin refused to speak to Murray for nearly a decade afterward, an unusually strong reaction from someone known for his professional courtesy, even with difficult co-workers. What bothered Steve most wasn't that Bill was trying to be funny, said a director who worked with both comedians. It was that Murray seemed to believe that his impulses were naturally more valuable than the work everyone else had put into creating the segment. That kind of disrespect for group effort is something Steve simply cannot stand. This difference of opinion appears to extend beyond a single incident to include totally different approaches to comedy itself. Martin's carefully constructed humor stands in stark contrast to Murray's improvisational style, which often thrives on disruption and unexpected moments. Steve apparently described Murray as brilliant but destructive, said a longtime co-worker. He felt that Bill treats comedy like warfare, that he's willing to break trust and undermine others to get a laugh. For someone like Steve, who sees comedy as a careful construction built on mutual trust, that's simply unacceptable. What makes this tension particularly notable is that both men are respected as comedy legends, though with totally different approaches to their craft. Their inability to find common ground represents one of comedy's great what-if scenarios, a collaboration between two giants that never happened due to irreconcilable differences in professional philosophy. Oh, thanks. That's so much better. Yeah, boy. That's comfortable. 5. Robin Williams. The improvisational whirlwind. The tension between Steve Martin and Robin Williams apparently came not from personal dislike, but from a basic incompatibility in their approaches to comedy. A clash between Martin's precisely structured humor and Williams' free-flowing improvisational genius. People who saw their interactions said that this difference of opinion became most apparent during a television appearance in the early 1990s, when both comedians were featured guests. What should have been a showcase of two comedy legends instead became an object lesson in contrasting styles. Steve had prepared carefully, as he always does, said a producer who worked on the show. He had scripted remarks ready with perfectly timed setups and punchlines. Robin arrived with Robin. Pure improvisation, pure stream of consciousness energy. The segment apparently quickly fell apart into what one witness described as comedy chaos, when Williams began riffing, interrupting Martin's prepared material with rapid-fire improvisations that completely derailed the planned structure of the appearance. You could see Steve trying to maintain the framework of what he'd prepared, while Robin was essentially tearing down the building around him, said a writer who was present. It wasn't mean on Robin's part. That was simply how his genius worked. But for someone like Steve, who sees comedy as precision engineering, it was genuinely distressing. People familiar with the situation said that Martin later described the experience as like trying to read poetry on a roller coaster, a good comparison for the collision between his measured approach and Williams' kinetic energy. What makes this tension particularly sad is that Martin apparently had enormous respect for Williams' talent and creativity. The issue wasn't a lack of appreciation, but a basic incompatibility in methods. Steve didn't consider Robin evil in the traditional sense, said a co-worker who knew both men. But in Steve's world of carefully constructed comedy, Williams' chaos without structure represented a form of creative sabotage, however brilliant the results might sometimes be. This difference of opinion apparently made Martin reluctant to work directly with Williams, despite opportunities that arose over the years. Industry insiders said that Martin said no to several projects that would have paired the two comedians, believing their styles were simply too different to create effective collaboration. "It's like trying to combine architecture and jazz improvisation," said a director who worked with both men at different times. "Both are legitimate art forms. Both require immense talent, but they operate according to completely different principles." Steve builds comedy like Frank Lloyd Wright designed buildings. Robin created comedy like John Coltrane played saxophone in the moment, following inspiration wherever it led. This clash of comedy philosophies represents one of the great might have been collaborations in entertainment history. Two legendary talents whose approaches to their craft made meaningful partnership virtually impossible. "Goldie, it is so kind of you to do this. I can't think of a better person to have given me this award. But I will thank you later in a more manly way." Music 6. Goldie Hawn, the schedule disruptor. The reported tension between Steve Martin and Goldie Hawn apparently began during the filming of Housesitter in 1992. What should have been a straightforward romantic comedy collaboration apparently revealed big differences in their approaches to professionalism and performance. Crew members who worked on the film said that Hawn's work habits stood in stark contrast to Martin's famously careful preparation and punctuality. She apparently arrived late to set on multiple occasions, disrupting the carefully planned shooting schedule and creating cascading delays that affected the entire production. "Steve is almost obsessively punctual," said a production assistant who worked on Housesitter. "He sees being on time as a basic form of respect for everyone else's time and effort." When Goldie would show up an hour late, forcing dozens of people to wait around, you could see it genuinely bothered him on a moral level, not just a practical one. The tension apparently extended beyond scheduling issues to their different approaches to the material itself. Multiple sources said that Hawn frequently improvised dialogue without warning, catching Martin off guard and disrupting the rhythm of scenes he had carefully prepared. Steve approaches dialogue like a musician approaches a music score. He believes in honoring the writer's intentions and finding the perfect timing within that framework, said a director who worked with Martin on other projects. Goldie's approach was much more free-form. She changed lines on the fly, which left Steve constantly having to adjust and recalibrate. Perhaps most personally irritating, people familiar with the situation said, was an incident in which Hawn apparently made fun of Martin's banjo playing, a deeply personal passion that has been central to his creative life for decades. "The banjo isn't just a hobby for Steve. It's a serious artistic pursuit he's dedicated thousands of hours to mastering," said a co-worker familiar with Martin's musical career. Having that dismissed or mocked would have struck at something very close to his heart. While both performers maintained professional courtesy throughout the film's production and promotional tour, industry insiders noted that Martin apparently said no to all later opportunities to work with Hawn, despite her continued commercial viability as a co-star. Steve apparently described Goldie as a passive-aggressive performer who used charm as cover for dismissiveness and ego, said a producer who worked with both actors. He felt she weaponized her bubbly persona to get away with behavior that would have been immediately called out if it came from a less charismatic performer. This experience apparently reinforced Martin's commitment to working only with those who shared his professional values, specifically respect for schedules, preparation, and the collaborative nature of filmmaking itself. Housesitter stands as an interesting case study in how two successful performers can create an effective final product for audiences while privately finding the collaboration process so difficult that they never work together again. A reminder that what appears seamless on screen often conceals complex interpersonal dynamics behind the scenes. Some guys that grow their hair real long then like they swoop it over. You can do a lot like that. You can get a pompadour and everything. My hair doesn't grow long enough to swoop it over. 7. Charles Grodin. The deadpan disaster. The problems between Steve Martin and Charles Grodin apparently came not from their direct interaction, but from witnessing Grodin's controversial interview style, particularly during an appearance on The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson that Martin also attended. People who were there said that Grodin used his signature deadpan confrontational persona, acting hostile, dismissive, and deliberately difficult throughout the interview. While this was Grodin's established comedic character for talk show appearances, the effect on the actual humans involved apparently disturbed Martin deeply. Steve was waiting backstage to come on next, watching the monitor as Charles did his usual hostile interview bit with Johnny, said a Tonight Show staff member who was present that evening. What viewers at home might have found amusing, Steve saw from a different perspective. He watched Johnny genuinely struggling to maintain the show's rhythm, while Grodin deliberately sabotaged the normal interview flow. Multiple sources said that Martin was particularly disturbed by how Grodin's performance affected Carson, for whom Martin had enormous professional respect. Steve apparently told a producer afterward that he found it painful to watch someone deliberately making Johnny look bad for their own comedic purposes, said a co-worker who was present. He felt Grodin was essentially using Carson as an unwitting straight man in a bit the host hadn't agreed to participate in. What apparently bothered Martin most wasn't the concept of Grodin's confrontational character, but the real discomfort it created for others who weren't willing participants in the bit. Steve believes comedy should either be clearly fictional or based on mutual agreement, said a writer who worked with Martin. What Grodin was doing existed in this uncomfortable middle ground, where he was deliberately creating real tension with someone who wasn't prepared for it, all in service of his own persona. After witnessing this appearance, Martin apparently described Grodin's approach as weaponized awkwardness and expressed concern about comedy that relied on genuine discomfort rather than crafted humor. Steve apparently said Grodin seemed committed to the bit, but left a trail of resentment in his wake, said a producer familiar with Martin's reactions. For someone who believes deeply in the collaborative nature of comedy and entertainment, that approach was fundamentally problematic. While Martin and Grodin never had significant direct professional interaction, this incident apparently reinforced Martin's commitment to a form of comedy that didn't rely on creating actual discomfort or putting unwitting participants in uncomfortable positions. What Steve objected to wasn't the deadpan persona itself, said a director who worked with Martin. It was using that persona in a way that created genuine awkwardness for others who hadn't signed up to be part of the bit. In his view, that crossed an important line between comedy and cruelty. Marty, I would address somebody, get a phone book so you can see me. 8. Don Rickles. The roast that went too far. The reported tension between Steve Martin and legendary insult comic Don Rickles apparently came from a roast-style event in the 1980s, where Rickles' traditionally sharp humor apparently crossed a line into territory Martin found genuinely hurtful. People who were there said that Rickles' set included jokes about Martin's recent divorce and financial matters, subjects that went beyond the typical good-natured ribbing of a comedy roast into more personally painful territory. Don was doing what Don always did, insulting everyone in sight, said someone who witnessed the event. But there was a sharpness to his comments about Steve's personal life that felt different from his usual material. You could see that it had landed differently than the typical Rickles barbs. Martin, known for his good humor and ability to take a joke, apparently maintained his composure throughout the event. But people close to him said that the experience left a lasting impression about the line between comedy and cruelty. Steve believes firmly that there are boundaries even in comedy, said a co-worker who knows Martin well. He felt Rickles had deliberately targeted genuinely painful aspects of his life, rather than the more superficial subjects typical of a roast format. Industry insiders said that Martin never publicly criticized Rickles, but quietly said no to participate in any later events or programs that would have placed them together in similar circumstances. What bothered Steve most wasn't being the target of jokes. He's always been fine with that, said a producer who worked with Martin. It was the sense that Rickles had deliberately chosen the most painful possible topics rather than the light-hearted subjects that make roast humor work. This incident apparently informed Martin's own approach to comedy, reinforcing his belief that humor should ultimately come from a place of empathy rather than cruelty. That the best comedy punches up rather than exploiting genuine vulnerability. Steve apparently said that, "Sometimes cruelty is the joke," when describing Rickles' approach, said a writer who worked with Martin. He respected Don's place in comedy history, but fundamentally disagreed with a style that could cause actual emotional pain under the guise of entertainment. What makes this tension particularly interesting is that it highlights the subjective nature of comedy itself, how the same performance can be perceived as brilliantly transgressive by some and unnecessarily hurtful by others. "Steve wasn't arguing that Rickles shouldn't exist as a performer," said the co-worker. He was simply establishing his personal boundary about what kind of comedy he wanted to be associated with, and what kind of comedy he felt crossed important moral lines. In Martin's worldview, people who know him well said, "Comedy at its best brings people together through shared recognition of life's absurdities. Comedy that deliberately causes pain, even in the name of entertainment tradition, represents a fundamental misuse of the art form's power." Actually bought the "Wouldn't that surprise the record company? Think, this is unbelievable." "Yeah, of course. I-9. Burt Reynolds, the prank war escalator." The problems between Steve Martin and Burt Reynolds apparently came from Reynolds's notorious love for elaborate practical jokes and physical comedy that sometimes disrupted the carefully constructed rhythm of television appearances. People familiar with their interactions said that Martin became increasingly frustrated with Reynolds' unpredictable behavior during Tonight Show appearances, where both were guests. Reynolds was famous for his prank wars with Johnny Carson, often involving shaving cream attacks, water guns, and other physical gags that created chaos on set. Steve approaches television appearances with incredible preparation, said a producer who worked on several Tonight Show episodes featuring both men. He times his stories perfectly, prepares his material carefully, and treats each appearance as a crafted performance. Burt's approach was essentially to throw a comedic hand grenade into the middle of that careful structure. The clash apparently came to a head during a panel appearance, where Reynolds's physical pranks repeatedly disrupted segments Martin had prepared carefully, forcing him to abandon prepared material as the show devolved into what one witness described as kindergarten chaos. You could see Steve's frustration building as Burt kept escalating the physical comedy, said a stage manager who was present. "There's a difference between spontaneous fun and deliberately derailing someone else's prepared work." And that line was definitely crossed that night. People close to Martin said that he privately described Reynolds as a 12-year-old with a death wish, a reference to Reynolds' seemingly boundless enthusiasm for physical comedy regardless of the consequences for others' planned material. "What bothered Steve wasn't that Burt was playful or funny," said a co-worker who knows Martin well. "It was that his need for attention through pranks and physical comedy came at the expense of others who had put in the work to prepare something thoughtful for the audience." This difference of opinion apparently led Martin to request that he not be booked on panel shows with Reynolds, a quiet boundary setting that reflected his desire to protect the integrity of his carefully constructed comedic approach. Steve apparently said of Burt, "He was fun until he wasn't," said a talent coordinator who worked with both men. That perfectly captured Steve's view of Reynolds's approach to comedy. Initially entertaining, but ultimately exhausting because it recognized no boundaries and respected no one else's preparation. What makes this tension particularly interesting is that it highlights the fundamental difference between Martin's architectural approach to comedy and Reynolds' more improvisational physical style, a difference that made meaningful collaboration between two of entertainment's biggest stars effectively impossible. "Steve doesn't consider Burt evil in any real sense," said a friend of Martin's, "more like careless enough to count." Someone whose need for attention through physical comedy made him potentially destructive to more carefully constructed entertainment.